First of all, is the name Old Testament. Where does this come from? And what are the implications of calling the Tanakh, calling it the Old Testament? Well, the title Old Testament arose from early Christian communities that were seeking to differentiate the writings of the New Covenant from the writings of the Mosaic Covenant. But this was based on a perceived discontinuity. Here's a big word, discontinuity. What does that mean? Something that is coming along and then it's supposed to tie in with the next phase, but it's like some things don't transfer. Kind of like when you get a new phone and you try to transfer all your old data from your new phone, and not everything makes it, right? So there's a discontinuity there. Well, that's what they were saying, that from the old to the new, there were some things here that were canceled, that were abolished, and didn't transfer to the New Testament. And of course, we are familiar with that kind of a teaching, right? So we call that discontinuity. Some people see continuity, some people see discontinuity, and we're going to see how those things they're not necessarily good or bad in themselves. And we'll see how to sort that out, because some of that continuity and discontinuity is going to end up being replacement theology. So we got to be careful with that. And it comes also from a sense of replacement theology. So these new and emerging Christian communities, they were looking at the two, the old and the new, and they were seeing some different things because of the lenses they already had, right? And so they were trying to differentiate between the new covenant and the Mosaic covenant, but it was based on their perceived discontinuity between the two, right? Is anybody trying to ask a question? You may want to unmute yourself just so that we do not hear everything on your background. Does that make sense? Or actually, I'm going to, let's see. I'm going to go ahead and mute everyone. And if you have a question, then I'm going to ask you, use that little hand raising thingy. Does that make sense? All right. By the way, this is being recorded. So that you can have, I will email a link to the video probably tomorrow when I have a chance to just edit it a little bit. Okay, so the name Old Testament comes from Christian communities seeking identity and reading a discontinuity between the covenants. Because they saw, we're in the middle of the sentence here, because they saw, as they saw, the old covenant replaced and fulfilled by the new. I don't know if you knew, but there are three names for replacement theology. There is, or three kinds of replacement theology. And one is punitive supersessionism. Supersessionism is another name for replacement theology, right? The church has replaced Israel. And it is because it is punitive, meaning it is a punishment. So God is punishing Israel for rejecting the Messiah. There's another one that the name escapes me right now, is some fancy name, but the third one is this one here. It's called fulfillment theology. So kind of like when people read Matthew 5:17, right? I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. And so they interpret that and they say that when he fulfilled it, He abolished it. How can that be? That makes no sense. He said, I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. And then they say to fulfill means to abolish. That makes no logical sense. And so that kind of fulfillment theology, when he fulfilled it, he abolished it. You see how right there is a replacement that takes place. So the very first kind of replacement that took place was replacement between the testaments.
Joey?
Was to see that, or to conceive theologically, that the new covenant was displacing the old. And that has to do with continuity and discontinuity. And of course, I know that you may have a lot of questions, what about all the sacrifices in Leviticus? Well, you're going to have to not miss that day when we talk about Leviticus. We'll get there. We'll get there. But do keep in mind that this issue of continuity and discontinuity, this replacement of the new covenant and the old of the old covenant by the new, it goes back to replacement theology.
Joey?
Gary, did you have a question?
Yes, sir.
I'm sorry, I think I muted you. Can you start again? Unmute yourself and start again.
I was going to talk to you about dual covenant theology, where believers believe that the Jewish people don't have their own covenant. They don't need Yeshua. They don't need Jesus. It's called dual covenant theology, where they have their own covenant. They don't need anything else except they have God has automatically saved them because of the dual covenant theology. Would you call that a form of anti-Semitism, or a form of maybe a replacement theology, dual covenant theology?
I don't think it's replacement theology, because it is clearly trying to include the Jews, right? I don't think it's replacement theology, but I think it is wrong. Now I want you to let me read Acts 4:12 to answer that question real quick. Acts 4:12, it says, and there is salvation in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven that has been given among men by which we must be saved. Now look at verse 13. Verse 13, I think, is actually extremely important here. It says, now, as they observed the confidence of Peter and John and understood that they were uneducated and untrained men, they were amazed, and they began to recognize them as having been with Yeshua. So here's the thing. The ones who said this was actually Peter. And he was preaching exclusively to Jewish people. So Peter is telling the Jews, sorry, there is no salvation under heaven, only through the one name, Yeshua. So, yeah, this dual covenant, that's not biblical. And as sad as it is, as tough as it is, it's an error. So, all right. So finish out the sentence here on our notes. This was part of establishing an identity for the church apart from Judaism. So look at everything that's involved in using this term, Old Testament. It came from an attempt to establish an identity for the church apart from Judaism. This was the result then of reading the Mosaic covenant from the Pharisaic point of view. And as being imposed on the Gentile believer. So what this means is in you hopefully you can get this and you will see this. Clearly, the way the Pharisees were seeing the law and were applying the law in general, I'm saying Pharisees in general, not all Pharisees are created equal. They were not all bad people. They were not, I'm not saying that at all. But what I'm saying is the system as a whole, in general, the way they were looking at the Mosaic covenant and its application, how to live it out, was not correct. Therefore, Yeshua was correcting so many of their teachings, right? Now, when Christians look at the Torah itself, at the law itself, at Moses itself, they see it through the Pharisees. And so they see the Torah as if the Torah is in itself bad and legalistic and bondage producing. But you can't look at the Torah through the lens of a misinterpretation. That's not fair to the Torah, because Romans 7 says that the Torah is good, the commandment is good and holy, and it is from God. But the early Christians were looking at the Old Testament, at the Torah, at the Tanakh, from a Pharisaic point of view, and afraid that somebody was trying to impose that on them. So they were overreacting against this instead of studying. So the reaction was to see the Old Testament with great discontinuity, meaning so many of the things from the Mosaic covenant did not transfer into the new covenant. And for them, they saw it that this was intentional, that God was actually doing that. And that set off a 2,000-year interpretation of the Tanakh and of the Torah that we are just now beginning to undo in our time. So that's for the name Old Testament. Let's talk about now the Hebrew Bible. So the title Hebrew Bible emphasizes the cultural linguistic heritage of the Jewish people and is often preferred by Jewish scholars and communities to emphasize the origin and meaning of the scriptures within Judaism, distinct from its interpretation in Christian theology. So, while the content of the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament is the same, the terminology used reflects different theological perspectives. And this is preferred, in my opinion. This is preferred. It's kind of a neutral term, right? It's the Old Testament is charged with a lot of theology. Well, Hebrew Bible is also charged with a positive message, but it's not so theological. It's just saying, hey, these are the scriptures of the Jewish people. And now this can be interpreted as Jews rejecting Christianity and the Messiah. Especially because it does not include the New Testament. So it does have a little bit of truth to that. However, from the Jewish point of view, it is also a rejection of the Christian claims of discontinuity. That says, I need to correct this, that says that the law of Moses was abolished. That says that the law of Moses was abolished. So, of course, Israel is rejecting this, and Jewish people in Judaism is rejecting this. The law of Moses is not abolished. You guys don't know what you're talking about. Well, I mean, both groups are wrong. Okay. Then we come to the name Tanakh, which is what we are using here, right? So the word Tanakh comes, I think I misspelled it here too. The word Tanakh comes from the abbreviation TNK, created from the initial letters of the three main divisions of the Hebrew Bible, meaning the Torah, that's where we get the T, the Torah, the Nevi'im, which means the prophets, that's where we get the N, and then the K comes from the Ketuvim, which is the writings. So T and K, you put vowels there, and you have Tanakh. And this is a way of referring to the Hebrew Bible, to all the Hebrew Bible, the whole canon of the Hebrew scriptures. So the term is not explicitly found in ancient Jewish texts. So you're not going to find it in the Mishnah and such. However, the concept of the threefold division of the Hebrew scriptures has ancient roots. Guess where the best roots are? Well, they're actually in the New Covenant scriptures. So look at Matthew 5:17, right? We read it a moment ago, what we were talking about it a moment ago. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. So here we see Yeshua referring to the Tanakh, right, in 2 out of the 3 sections. But look at Luke 24:44. Here we have all 3 in the mouth of Yeshua again. He said, this is what I told you while I was still with you, that everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, in the prophets, and in the Psalms. So the word Psalms is substitute for the Ketuvim, because the Psalms is the number 1 and the biggest book in the writings. So we have the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. And the number 1 book in the writings is the book of Psalms. And so Yeshua here is actually referring to this threefold way of arranging the Tanakh. And even though he didn't use the word Tanakh, this is, it was in development, and it was already viewed, the scriptures were already viewed this way. So this is the term we're going to prefer and that we're going to use here. Any questions thus far? Very good. We're going to keep moving right along then. Now we're going to talk about the content of the Tanakh. The name Tanakh refers to the three sections of the Hebrew Bible: the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. So let's talk about the Torah first. Let's talk about the meaning of the word itself. We know this one, right? The Hebrew word Torah generally means instruction and teaching. It does not mean law. There are other words that talk about different kinds of commandments. But the Torah is actually not one of them. The Torah means instruction and teaching. Now, the term is used in at least 2 technical ways, right? So there is a general meaning, and then there are 2 technical ways, 2 technical meanings of the word Torah itself. So number 1 is the collective name of the first 5 books of the Bible. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So we know this as the Pentateuch. Don't be afraid of the word Pentateuch. This is a Jewish word. This is a word given to the Torah when the Jewish people translated the Tanakh into Greek. This was about 250 years before Yeshua, so before Christianity. This was not translated by Christianity. The word Pentateuch is not a Christian word in itself, in origin, but it's actually a Jewish word. So the word Pentateuch comes from the Greek, and it means 5. Penta means 5, and tukos means the scrolls in which the covers in which the scrolls were kept. And so that way it came to mean the 5 scrolls or the 5 books, which we now know as in Hebrew as the Torah. So that's the Pentateuch. So that's the first technical use of the word Torah. The second technical use refers to 14 specific technical instructions for priests in the books of Leviticus and Numbers. And it talks about two different areas. It talks about how to handle the blood and the flesh of the sacrifices. And it talks about instructions for specific cases of impurity, of clean and unclean. So in this sense, the word Torah is actually a very, very technical term. It means specific instructions for the priest on how to handle the blood of the sacrifices and the flesh, and how to detect specific kinds of uncleanness and how to help people overcome that. So the word Torah, in general means instruction, teaching. It means the first 5 books of the Bible, but then it has this technical terms that is used 14 times in this specific way. And I have it here listed for you, actually, all 14 of them. So we read in Leviticus 6:9. This is the law of the burnt offering. This is the instruction for the priest regarding the burnt offering. And then we have, now this is the instruction for the grain offering. This is the instruction for the sin offering, the instruction for the guilt offering. Chapter 7, the instruction for the sacrifice of peace offering. And then number 6, I want you to notice how it's kind of a summary statement, right? This is the instruction of the burnt offering, the grain offering, the sin offering, the guilt offering. And look, it adds a new one. It says, and the ordination offering. And then it gives you the last one, the sacrifice of peace offering. Oh, we haven't seen that ordination offering. It's not in the first 5 chapters of Leviticus, but guess what? It's in chapters 8 through 8 and 9, when the priest Aaron and his sons are ordained. That's why it's called the ordination offering. And so this is the instruction for the ordination offering, because the ordination offering is a type of peace offering. How do we know this? Well, because you can actually eat it. The priests, they had to eat from it. And the only sacrifice from which the person who offers it also eats is the peace offering. And as a matter of fact, the Passover sacrifice is also a type of peace offering, right? Because the person who offers it has to eat from it. So there you go. We're throwing in some Leviticus here ahead of time. Then those are the 6 sacrifices. The 6 uses of the word Torah in a technical sense that have to deal with the blood, how to handle the blood, and how to handle the flesh of the sacrifice. Now, the rest of them, from 7 to 14, they deal with, these are specific instructions for uncleanness, different types of uncleanness. So let's look at them real quick. It says, this is the instruction regarding the animal and the bird and every living thing that moves in the waters and everything that swarms on the earth. And if you remember your Leviticus chapter 11, this is the last verse of chapter 11. This is talking about the clean and unclean animals. So this is the instruction about the clean and unclean animals. So it's a technical use of the word Torah, and it refers specifically to this. The next one is, it says, this is the Torah, this is the instruction for her who bears a child, whether a male or a female. We're familiar with that. That's Leviticus 12. Then the next one, it says, this is the Torah, the instruction for the mark of leprosy, which actually is not a good translation, because leprosy is a different kind of disease. The one, where it eats away the fingers or the toes or the nose, things like that. That's not the biblical leprosy. Somebody mistranslated the Greek, I don't know, maybe in King James or something. And but the problem is that we don't have a good word to translate the Hebrew word. The Hebrew word is sarat, and what it boils down is to a set, because this is not just one thing, it's a set of skin diseases. So several kinds of skin diseases. And this is now here's the thing. Here is saying that this is the mark of Sara'at in a garment or of wool or linen. So what do we do with this one now? Because now we cannot translate it as a skin disease. Well, if you read your TLV Bible, right, the Tree of Life version, the Messianic version, it actually does not translate this word. The word translated leprosy, it doesn't translate it, it leaves it in Hebrew, and it leaves the word sara'at, because they can be applied not only to the skin of a person, but also to garments. And so I think today we will call this something like a mold. I think that's what this boils down to when it deals with uh, this in a piece of garment, or actually the chapter is going to talk about, a house can be, the walls of a house can be infected with this, and it's actually molding. And so this is the instructions for what to do, when this takes place. And that's as far as we're going to go with that one. So I know you may have other questions. Maybe later we can talk about it. Then we have number 10, but look at number 10. This thing doesn't want to work for me. Number 10, we have it in 4 different scriptures, but look, they're all in chapter 4, in chapter 14. So it's kind of a repetition, that this is the instruction about the tzaraat in a person. This is the actual skin disease. So that's what chapter 14 is all about. So that's another technical use of the word Torah. Then we come to chapter 15. This is the chapter for adult learning. This is where we talk about emissions of or discharge, talk about seminal emission, or I guess the next verse or something is going to talk about menstruation. So that's why I call this the adult chapter in Leviticus, right? So this is the instruction for this type of uncleanness. That's the point we're making today. We're not going into the details of this, but the point is that this is the instruction for this type of uncleanness. Then we jump over to the book of Numbers. And in the book of Numbers, we see 3 more cases of the word Torah used in a very technical sense for specific uncleanness. So we have in chapter 5 the instruction regarding jealousy, and you prepare the little water, and the wife is supposed to take it. The guy is a jerk because the wife wasn't cheating on him. Maybe he's the one cheating, or okay, we're not going to get into all the drama of this, but it's an interesting passage, right? But our point here today is simply that there is such a thing as the instruction for this. Then in Numbers 6, we have, this is the instruction for the Nazarite. So it's a technical use of the word Torah. This is the Torah of the Nazarite, the instruction for the Nazarite. And then the last one in chapter 19, this is the instruction when a man dies in a tent, when somebody dies, not in the open air, but in some kind of a building, what to do and what becomes unclean, and all of that chapter. That's chapter 19 of Numbers. But the point here is that the word Torah is used in a very technical sense, and I'm giving you all of the verses where that is given. There aren't any more outside of that when it is used in this technical sense. All right, so in this class, then we're going to talk about the Torah, as the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of Moses. All right, so far we've been talking about the Torah and the meaning of the word, right? The meaning of the word Torah. Now we're going to switch and talk about the genre of the Torah. Okay, what does that mean? What are we talking about here? Well, you've heard of different musical genres, right? So some people like rock, some people like country and everything in between, and we got all kinds of genres. Well, in literature, we also have genres, of course. In the Bible, being a work of literature par excellence, we have different literary genres in scripture. So, but there's also a different type of genre. So we're going to talk about these two types of genre. So there are at least two types of genre: the literary genre and the discourse genre. The literary genre has to do with the type of literature in which a text is written. And I'm not talking about, well, I mean, you can write a text as in an iPhone text, or a Google phone text. That can actually be, you can write poetry in a text, or you can write a list, for the husband when he's at Walmart, get me this and get me that, or vice versa. Those are different types of literature. So it has literary genre. So in the Torah, then we have, for example, in the Torah contains the literary genre of prose and poetry, right? You've seen the poetry at the end of Genesis when Jacob blesses his sons. That's poetry. We also have genealogy. We have reports. We have lists. We have even a travel log at the end of the book of Numbers when Moses is saying, and then we went, they're telling all of the places where the ark stopped and the camp had to stop. And then we have different kinds of laws. We have absolute laws, absolute commandments like thou shalt not. Or we have performative commandments, you shall observe my feast. Or you have prohibited commandments. You shall not drink the blood with the meat. Or you have case laws. When a man becomes a slave, you ought to set him free after 7 years, and so on and so on. And if it is a woman, then you do this. And if the man is married, then you do this. So you see how it's a case law. It presents different cases. All of those things are different types of literary genre. And you're going to see how that's important, okay, as we move along in our study. Also, we have then the different genres of discourse genre. So the genres of discourse found in the Torah are historical narrative, predictive narrative. You can kind of see where predictive narrative is. It is prophecy. It is narrating the future. It's giving you a narrative, but it hasn't happened yet. So it's predicting what is going to happen. So you have historical narrative, that those are stories, Genesis, Exodus, all of that. Then you have predictive narrative. You have exposition, instruction, like in Leviticus. You have procedure, it's also in Leviticus. This is what you do with the blood. And then you have hortatory. Hortatory is behavior. This is the book of Leviticus, the book of Deuteronomy. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind, and you shall bind these words, and you shall write them on the doorpost, and you shall, these are all the stuff that you need to do. It's a specific kind of commandments, that drive at your behavior. Paul, for instance, Paul, we see in a book like Ephesians, right? Ephesians 1, 2, and 3 is an exposition. So that's the type of discourse genre. But then he moves on in chapter 4, 5, and 6, talking about commandments, giving commandments. This is hortatory. So an epistle like the Ephesians is written in two different types of genres. So primarily, the genre of the Torah is the historical narrative. That's the primary genre. Primarily, the Torah is a narrative. It's telling us a story. So that is, the Torah tells a story that, although long and elaborate, is a unity. because all historical narrative have plot structure, the Torah also has plot structure. Okay, what are we talking about here? Well, the plot, we're going to talk a lot about plot. And even in a little bit, we're going to talk about plot. Um, uh, and the plot has to do with the five ways to tell a story. So every story is going to have an introduction and a conclusion, and it's going to introduce a problem. So you're going to have a conflict. This problem is going to grow until you have a climax, which is a confrontation, and then you're going to have a consequence. This is where the story tells you the moral of the story. This is what the story is all about. So every story is going to have all of these 5 points, and they're going to be super elaborate. So every movie that you watch, every novel that you read, every story is going to have those 5 points. And we're going to see that how scripture has that and how the Torah specifically has that, not only at the individual stories, but each book has all of those. And the Torah as a whole also has a plot in itself. So that's the way we're going to study it. So now let's talk about the literary structure of the Torah. So the literary structure of a text has to do with how the author organized the content to achieve a strategic presentation that helps convey the desired meaning. It's a mouthful, but we can, take it up in chunks. So an author is going to organize his or her content in a strategic way to convey the meaning that they want to convey. So this strategic way of organizing the content, that's what we call the literary structure. Now, the most basic literary structure of the Torah is the actual 5 books. So each book is a way to organize the Torah as a whole in order to convey the meaning. So every book achieves that. Yeah, it's a basic literary structure. Now, the content of the Torah is also organized into several narrative macro sections. All right, I think this is going to make sense as we actually look at these macro sections. I think this is going to make sense to you. In Genesis 1 through 9, we have the narrative of all humanity. There's one language, even after the flood, up to chapter 9, the end of the flood. Then we move into humanity organized into nations. We see the beginning of that in chapters 10 and 11. These are the macro sections of the Torah. Then next, we have the formation of the nation of Israel in the rest of Genesis 11 through 50. Then we move on to the Exodus narratives. So here we're looking at the big picture, right? We can see the story of Moses, Israel's bondage, and then the calling of Moses, and then Moses goes to Pharaoh, and we have all of the details. But if you combine all of that into one section, macro section, we can call this the Exodus narratives, all the way to chapter 15. Then we have, after that, the Sinai narratives. This is a huge section from Exodus 16 all the way to Numbers 9. In Numbers 9 is the end of their stay in Sinai, because in chapter 10, the cloud lifts up and moves, and the camp moves with the cloud. And so now they are departing Sinai. And then we enter into the desert or the wilderness narratives. I think I prefer to call this the wilderness narratives. And that's going to take us through the rest of the book of Numbers, because then in Deuteronomy, we have the discourses, the Deuteronomic discourses. And again, we're going to see all of this in detail, right? Each book. But you can see how the Torah is also organized in several macro sections. Here we have covered the whole of the Torah right there. And this, we can call this the literary structure. But we don't just have literary structure, we also have plot structure. This is far more important. Right here, when you talk about the literary structure, this is the content. This is a basic outline of the content of the Torah. Great, fine. Some of you at Sukkot, you've heard me say, this is like going to Home Depot and saying, well, here are all the components of a house. Here's everything that goes in a house, from the wood all the way to the roof, all the way to the appliances, even thermostats. They're going to sell you everything at Home Depot, everything that goes into a house. Great. What have you done? You haven't done anything for me. You didn't build me a house. How do you build a house? Okay, you build a house with the plot structure. Sure, it's important to list all of the components. It's important to work on the literary structure of a book or of a story, but you need to get to the plot structure. This is where we put the house together. And that's what this is the way we're gonna study each book of the Torah here. We're gonna see the literary structure, but then we're gonna spend more time on the plot structure. So the plot structure of a narrative is the 5-part structure of every story. As we said earlier, the conflict, the climax, the context, the conflict, the climax, the consequence, and the conclusion. Those are the 5 components of every story. That's what makes up the plot. All of that together is called the plot. So the plot of the Torah can be summarized in a suspenseful question. Here's my summary of the plot of the Torah. And I put it in a question form. Will Israel have faith to obey God and enter and possess the land? This is a summary statement of the Torah. This is what's happening in the Torah from a plot perspective. This is the suspense in the Torah. Is Israel going to have enough faith to obey God like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to enter the land as Moses is leading them, and to take possession of the land? Is Israel going to have enough faith to do that? We have the answer to that. The first generation did not have enough faith. They were not faithful to God. When they got to the border of the land, they saw the giants and they said, we're out of here. Can't do it. These guys are much bigger than we are. They didn't have faith. So God had to do all the work that we know, the second generation, the 40 years, everybody died and all that kind of stuff. And guess what? We're going to be back at the end of Numbers, at the beginning of Deuteronomy, and the entire book of Deuteronomy is going to be, will you have enough faith to believe God and to obey him so that you can enter and take possession of the land? And guess what? You end the whole of the Deuteronomy, the whole of the Torah, and you never get the answer to that question. It never actually happened. All right. So Michelle has a question.
Yeah, it's more of a comment on what you're saying. It's amazing when I'm reading your notes and I'm hearing you say that, and I'm realizing, wow, that is the same test that we all face in our daily lives. Will we have enough faith to obey God and enter the land that he is asking us to possess? It just hit me.
Yep.
It's amazing.
Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly. It works for salvation, it
Yes.
works for sanctification, and everything in between.
Yes. God is definitely a God of pattern.
Yes. And a God of stories. Very good. All right. So that is the Torah. Now we're going to apply the same thing to the prophets, right? We're studying the content of the Tanakh. And so we're seeing what's in the Torah, what's in the prophets, what's in the writings in a general sense, right? And during that saying, it wasn't that just that they didn't believe, but they didn't trust enough to live the way that God asked them to. Yes, that's why it's important that we say, will they have enough faith to obey God and do what he says, right? And all of that in there, it's not just believe, right? It's believe. Faith without works is dead. It's not the works that save you, but the works show that your faith is actually real. It's actually saving faith and trusting faith. So you got to have both. All right, so now we go into what is the content of the prophets. So in terms of the content, this is the division of the Tanakh called the Nevi'im, or the prophets. It has two sections. One is called the former prophets, and the other is called the latter prophets. The latter prophets is made up of the books that we know as the prophets. So the latter prophets is Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, all of them, and all the way to Malachi. So the three big ones plus the 12. Now, if you notice, we're saying the three big ones, and you may be wondering, well, after Jeremiah, doesn't it come, don't we have Lamentations after Jeremiah? And also, don't we have Daniel? Okay, we're going to talk about Lamentations and Daniel in a moment, okay? But for now, the latter prophets are the ones that we know as the prophets, right? Yeah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12. But get this. The former prophets is made up of the books that we consider, well, when I say we, I actually mean Christianity considers historical and not prophetic. So they will talk about the historical books. But in Judaism, they're called the prophets. They're called the former prophets, or the first or the earlier prophets. But guess what? Look at the books of the former prophets. Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. And wait a minute. Judges is the prophets? Joshua is the prophets? How about 1st and 2nd Samuel? That's definitely not. And 1st and 2nd Kings, that's definitely not prophets. What you talking about? Maybe you have Elijah in 1st Kings, but that's not the prophets. In what sense are these books the prophets? Well, I'm glad you asked. We're going to talk about that in a moment. Let's look at the literary and plot structure of the prophets, right? We did the same with the Torah. Now we're going to look at it for the prophets. Now, like the Torah, the structure, the most basic literary aspect of the prophets is that of the books themselves. So the literary structure, most basic, is that they come in books. Okay, easy. Now, some of these books are considered in Judaism as a unit. For instance, 1st and 2nd Samuel in Judaism is one book, and 1st and 2nd Kings is also one book. Now, the book of the 12, or the so-called minor prophets, they're also considered together as a unit. And in the among scholars today, they are beginning to look at the minor prophets also together, the 12 together as a unit, and they can see a plot, together, because they are all together are telling one story. It's fascinating. We're going to see a little bit of that later down the road. So in terms of literary genre, the former prophets are primarily prose. They're telling stories, right? With poetry placed in certain places, such as the Song of Deborah in the book of Judges, right, chapter 5, or the hymn of Hannah in 1 Samuel chapter 1, right? That's a poetry, but primarily these books are telling stories, they're prose. The latter prophets are also prose, meaning the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, the 12. They're also prose, but primarily prophetic and not historical. So they do have some historical accounts, but of course they are prophetic. They're the prophets. So they are narrating the future, what's going to happen, whether it is judgment, the day of the Lord, or blessing in how God is going to bless Israel. And it includes important poetic sections such as the servant song of Isaiah, and it also includes apocalyptic literature like what we have in the book of Zechariah. But that's the former prophets. Now here's the question. I'm sorry, that's the latter prophets. The latter prophets are they are the ones that we consider the prophets. The first ones are the books that are considered historic. So about the former prophets. So why are the books from Joshua to Kings included in the Nevi'im, in the prophets? Why are they included there? Well, the reason is that they have the same prophetic message as the latter prophets. So that together they are one. There are the Nevi'im, they are the prophets, the former and the latter, because they have one message together. That message is in question form is, will Israel have faith to obey God and maintain possession of the land? You see the subtle change there? In the Torah is, will Israel have faith to obey and enter and possess the land? And then in the prophets, altogether, the former and the latter prophets, the message is very close to the message of the Torah, right? Will Israel have faith to obey God and maintain possession? Will they gain possession in the Torah? Will they maintain possession in the prophets? And we know the answer to that. The answer is going to be absolutely not. Israel will lose possession of the land. They will be sent into exile. They will lose possession of the land for 70 years. And even after that, when they came back, they didn't have full control, right? They had all these empires over them. And they were independent for a little bit during the Maccabees, and then the Romans came and took it all back. So we see how closely related the messages are between the Torah and the prophets. Will Israel have faith to enter and possess the land? Will Israel have faith to maintain possession of the land? So all of the prophets are saying this, not only the latter prophets, but also the former prophets, meaning between Joshua and Kings. That's why Joshua 2 Kings, are considered the prophets, the former prophets. Why? Because they are preaching one message together with the other prophets. The books of Joshua, beginning with Joshua, the message to Israel is, will you have enough faith to obey God and maintain possession of the land? That's the reason why Joshua is considered the prophets and Judges and Samuel and Kings. Because the message to Israel is, will you have enough faith to maintain possession of the land? Does that make sense? All right. During the week, if you have further questions, you can always write to me, send me an email, send me a text, and we can clarify things a little better as well. You will also have access to this video, and you can go back in there, get to the place where you want to hear it again. Of course, you have the notes. You can see that pretty much what we're saying is what's on the notes, and then you can be taking your own notes and things like that. All right, so let's talk about the writings. The Ketuvim, or the writings, is the third section of the Tanakh, and it contains 13 books in the following order. We have Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Song of Songs, Ruth is there, Lamentations is there, Ecclesiastes, Esther, Daniel is there. I thought Daniel was a prophet. Well, we're going to see why. He is in the writings and not in the prophets. Nehemiah and Ezra, Nehemiah, and First and Second Chronicles. And you're like, well, but wait a minute. Isn't First and Second Chronicles pretty much the same as First and Second Kings? How can one be the prophets and the other one be the writings? Okay, we're going to see that. We're going to see it in a moment. It's easy, but we're going to see it. All right. In the Jewish accounts of these books, of some of these books, First and Second Chronicles are considered a single book, and also Ezra and Nehemiah are considered one book. You can see how closely related they are. Okay, here's a summary then. The book of Psalms occupies a special devotional place among Bible readers as a source of personal comfort. Psalms were also used for liturgical purposes to accompany sacrifices during the temple era. Here's the main point, that Psalms does not advance the history of Israel. So that's why it is not part of the Torah and it is not part of the prophets. It's almost like you have the main line here, the main line of the story, but this is a little vignette, that is going to give you more background. It enriches the story, but it doesn't advance the timeline of the story. That is done through the Torah and the prophets. But the writings, they're not part of the line of the story because they're kind of rather than chronological, they are more topical. So you're going to kind of take a little, 5 minutes in the movie is going to give you a little background into, okay, who is this guy? Who was this girl? Who, so going to give you some more background. That's what the book of Psalms does. Same with the book of Proverbs. So it's Proverbs reflects the wisdom and ethics that are derived from the commandments and the teachings of the Torah. Proverbs and Torah are really closely related. It's fascinating. Job seeks to understand human suffering in a fallen world. Song of Songs is a celebration of marital love and sexuality. Don't spiritualize Song of Songs. That's not, it becomes really weird when people do that. It's just straight up marriage. Ruth. Okay, Ruth. What about Ruth? Because Ruth comes right after Judges and before Samuel, and it's related to both, right? Well, Ruth is a backstory of the greatest Israelite king, King David. And although it is in the middle of the former prophets, Ruth is classified under the Ketuvim, perhaps for the simple reason of its small size. Nobody knows any, like super duper revelatory reason why Ruth is in the writings and not in the former prophets. Let me tell you this, that the place of Ruth in between Judges and Samuel It's that way only in the Christian Bible. But in the Hebrew Bible, in the Jewish Bible, even in the TLV, you're going to have a hard time. You're not going to find Ruth in between Judges and Samuel. You're going to have to go to the back of the book and find it in the Ketuvim, because that's where it is in the Jewish order of the books. It's a little different too. They're all there, but they're just in a little different order. And I think Yeshua would have been more familiar with that arrangement than, I think, if he picks up a Christian Bible, he will be like, who moved my Ruth here? Okay, Lamentations is a funeral poem lamenting the destruction of Solomon's temple. So even though it's written by Jeremiah, it has a different subject. Ecclesiastes is a philosophical presentation that contrasts the outcome of a life lived for pleasure with a life lived in the fear of God. Then Esther is the highly providential story of how God saved Jewish exiles in Persia through Queen Esther and Mordecai. And everybody says, yay! And we're not going to name the bad guy here. Boo. All right. Daniel. Although Daniel is an apocalyptic prophet, his book is not part of the Nevi'im, of the prophets, but is found in the Ketuvim because Daniel is a post-exilic book. That's the reason why. And we have all of these other books, they are post-exilic books, meaning they were written, if you remember, Daniel remembers that Jeremiah had prophesied, hey, the 70 years is up. It's time to return. And he's going to pray. So that's the reason why. Remember, Daniel was written after that, of course, right? So these are post-exilic books. That's the reason why these books are in the Ketuvim and not in the former prophets. So we have Esther and Daniel, Ezra and Nehemiah in 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So the same thing applies to 1st and 2nd Chronicles. When you see differences between Kings and Chronicles, it's going to be because Chronicles has a different audience. Kings is speaking to Israel before the exile, saying, Israel, repent, or you're going to be sent into exile. Chronicles is telling you, here's the reason why Israel was sent into exile. It's already looking back because this is from the perspective of post-exile.
Can you say that one more time, please?
Yes, that 1st and 2nd Chronicles has this very similar content to 1st and 2nd Kings, but they have different audiences, they have different perspectives. So 1st and 2nd Kings is speaking to Israel saying, repent or you will be sent into exile. And Chronicles is saying, here's the reason why we went into exile. Let us avoid that so that we retain possession of the land and are not sent into exile again. So that's why 1st and 2nd Chronicles is in the writings and not in the former prophets like 1st and 2nd Kings. Does that make sense? All right. Although Ezra and Nehemiah in 1st and 2nd Chronicles are historical narratives, their composition is post-exilic. So we're going to see that they have plot, but they are in the Ketuvim. Finally, the former prophets are pre-exilic because they warn Israel that their unfaithfulness to God will lead them to lose the possession of the land and be sent into exile. So there we have that. Here's the literary structure of the writings. So among the various genres that characterize the books of the writings are poetry, wisdom literature, historical narratives, love poetry, and apocalyptic literature like Daniel. Each of the book of the writings is independent and it contributes to the overall narrative of the Tanakh by giving it depth, but they're not literarily linked to one another. You know, like the Torah is, how Genesis and Exodus, they are linked to one another. That's not the case with Psalms and Daniel, or Ezra and Proverbs, things like that. All right, so finally, let's talk about the plot structure of the writings. So the rest of the books of the Ketuvim are narratives with a plot structure, like Ruth, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, First and Second Chronicles. With the exception of Ruth, these books are written from a post-exilic perspective, even if they recount pre-exilic times, like First and Second Chronicles. The prophetic sections of Daniel are predictive narratives by nature, so they have plot. And the general plot of the books of Ezra and Nehemiah is this: will Israel have faith and faithfulness, right, to return to the land and retain possession of it? So small variation there, but we see how they relate to the plot of the prophets and of the Torah. So the combined books of First and Second Chronicles evaluate the reason that led Israel to be exiled from the land. Something like that. All right, we have 30 minutes and we still have a lot to cover. So let's see how far we get, because this is really exciting stuff. All right, so you see here a little chart that I have. Look kind of fancy. Things moving, verses here and there. So we're going to take a look at these passages. You're going to see this is fun. This is exciting. All right, so now we're going to talk about the literary structure of the whole Tanakh. We've been talking about literary structure of the Torah, literary structure of the prophets, but now is the whole Tanakh. The Tanakh shows signs that its major sections, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, have been intentionally connected to express themselves as a unit. In other words, the Tanakh is not a collection of unrelated parts, but at the seams, I want you to picture this, at the seams, meaning when I connect the Torah and the prophets at the seams, when they come together, the way you put two pieces of cloth together and you make a shirt, you make pants, you make whatever. At the seams, when they come together, when the Torah and the prophets come together, there at the seams, there is evidence of organic unity. When the Torah comes together with the former prophets, there is evidence of organic unity. We're going to see it in a moment. So the following graphic highlights these connections in the final redaction when somebody put together all the books, right at the end. Some people think it was Ezra. He came at the very end and he combined the Torah and the prophets and the writings all together. So let's take a look at these passages here. Let's take a look at Deuteronomy 34, 1 through 8, and see how it combines with Joshua 1, 1 through 5, and then Deuteronomy 34, 9 to 12, and see how it combines to Joshua 1, 6 to 9. Can you see what's going on here a little bit? Deuteronomy 34 is the last chapter of the Torah. Joshua 1 is the first chapter of the former prophets, of the Nevi'im in general. And there is organic connection between them. The first half of Deuteronomy 34 connects to the first half of Joshua 1. And the second half of Deuteronomy 34 connects to the second half of Joshua 1. So at the seams, when the Torah and the prophets come together, there is something organic going on here to tell us this group of books, they go together. So let's take a look at them. Let me see if I can I'm gonna stop sharing that document for a moment and share with you my Bible so that way we are all on the same page. So we want to look at Deuteronomy 34. And we said we wanted to look at 1 through 8, verses 1 through 8. So I'm going to read this quick. Now, Moses went up from the plains of Moab, of Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which is opposite Jericho, and the Lord showed him all the land, Gilead as far as Dan, and all of Naphtali, and the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, and all of the land of Judah as far as the western sea, and the Negev, and the plain in the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees, as far as. So the Lord's going to show him all of this. Verse 7, although Moses was 120 years old when he died, his eye was not dim, nor his vigor abated. Actually, verse 5. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And he buried him. The Lord buried him in the valley in the land of Moab. Verse 8, so the sons of Israel wept for Moses in the place of Moab. Let's look now at Joshua 1. And in the first section, which is looking at 1 through 5, verses 1 through 5. Now it came about after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, that the Lord spoke to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' servant, saying, Moses, my servant, is dead. So you see the connection there between the end of the Torah and the beginning of the prophets. Moses is dead. And it's going to give some instructions here for Joshua. Verse 5, no man will be able to stand before you all the days of your life, just as I have been with Moses, I will be with you. I will not fail you nor forsake you. Now let's go back to Deuteronomy 34 to read the second half of the chapter, beginning in verse 9. Now Joshua the son of Nun was filled with the spirit of wisdom, and Moses had laid his hand on him, and the sons of Israel listened to him and did as the Lord had commanded Moses. Since that time, no prophet has risen. This is important. Let's pay attention to this. Since that time, verse 10, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face for all the signs and wonders which the Lord sent him to perform in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh, all his servants, and all his land, for all the mighty power, for all and for all the great terror which Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. So this is going to connect then to Joshua 6 through 9, 1, 6 through 9. So here we have 6 through 9, be strong and courageous. We know this passage, right? For you shall give this people possession of the land which I swore to their fathers to give them. Only be strong and courageous, very courageous. Be careful to do according to all the law which Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, so that you may have success wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth. You shall meditate on it day and night. Be careful to do according to it, that you may succeed. Have I not commanded you be strong and courageous? So here we see the commission of Joshua, both in chapter 34 of Deuteronomy and in chapter 1 of Joshua. All right. So that way we see that there is a connection at the seams where the Torah ends and the prophets begin. There's a thematic connection between the two, right? But also, let me go back for 1 second to this. Notice the other connections that are here. Notice how Deuteronomy 34 is going to connect all the way to the end of the prophets. The end of the prophet is Malachi. And the last chapter of Malachi is chapter 4, right? So the end of the Torah connects to the end of the prophets. We're gonna read Malachi. But also the beginning of the former prophets connects to the beginning of the writings. So then we're going to see how Joshua 1, 6 through 9, which we just read, connects to Psalm 1, which is the first chapter of the writings, right? And we're going to see how the last chapter of Deuteronomy connects to the last chapter of the former prophet, of the latter prophets of the Nevi'im. These are organic connections at the seams where these series of books come together. We see organic connections here. All right, so let's go back to the scripture so that we can read those passages again. And we just read Deuteronomy, so we're going to skip that. I'm going to go to Malachi 4 and then Psalm 1. And in Malachi 4, we're going to go to verses 4 to 6. So remember, this is the end of the prophets. Listen how it connects to the end of the Torah. Verse 4, it says, remember the Torah of Moses, my servant. Is that a connection to the Torah? Duh, of course. Even the statutes and ordinances which I commanded him in Horeb for all Israel. Behold, I am going to send you Elijah, the prophet, before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. He will restore the hearts of the fathers to their children and the hearts of the children to their fathers, so that I will not come and smite the land with a curse. Here's the thing. At the end of the Torah, chapter 34 of Deuteronomy, it says, there has not risen a prophet like Moses ever. That's the end of the Torah. The end of the prophet, it says, I am going to send you my prophet, Elijah. So here's what's fun. Those two then connect with the gospel, because in the gospel, we see Moses and Elijah coming to talk to Yeshua. It's not only the law and the prophets showing up to talk with Yeshua, but it is how they combine, how the Torah combines with the prophets. You know, you go from the prophets like Moses, which is Yeshua, and the prophet at the end of Malachi, which is John the Baptist. So all of these two are then seen in the Gospels when all of a sudden John the Baptist, the one prophesied in Malachi, comes to introduce Yeshua, who is the one prophesied in Deuteronomy 34. Gary, you have a question?
Just a comment, just like Michelle said, the pattern in the Bible is stunning. It's amazing, the pattern. We just have to look for it, and it's there. That's why we need to be Bereans, and God says for us to be Bereans so we can study to show ourselves approved.
That's what we're doing here. We're being good Bereans here. We're searching the scriptures. That's awesome. All right, so the final connection then that we see between them is we're going to see the connect. We already read Joshua 6 to 9, in which Moses told Joshua, be strong and courageous. Let this book of the Torah be in your heart, be in your mind, meditate on it day and night so that you may succeed. I think you can already anticipate Psalm 1, right? Psalm 1 relates to Joshua 1. How blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, or stand or sit, but his delights it's in the Torah of Adonai, and in his Torah he meditates day and night. He will be successful in everything he does. He is going to have fruitfulness show up in his life. That's Joshua 1. And what we have then is Joshua 1 is the beginning of the prophets, and Psalm 1 is the beginning of the writings. So there is an organic connection. When these collections of books come together, there is an organic connection. So here's the thing. This was done intentionally. Whoever had all the Psalms had to put them in a certain order. And that order was inspired by the Spirit of God. So David didn't sit down and say, well, let me write Psalm 1, guys. He wrote a psalm. He wrote many psalms, but guess what? He didn't write all the psalms. He didn't write half of the psalms. Maybe about half of the psalms are from David, but the other half are from different authors. So there had to be someone to come in and organize it all, because Psalms come in 5 books also. And the Spirit of God directed this person to say, this psalm that David wrote about the Torah, put it number 1, because it's going to go with Joshua. And that's how I want to show that the Tanakh comes together in a very organic kind of way. All right, let's go back here. So now you see how this little chart here comes into play, and it helps us see the literary structure of the Tanakh, how these things are put together by the Spirit of God and connected in such beautiful ways. Let's take a look now at the plot structure of the Tanakh. As a narrative unit, the Tanakh has an overall macro plot. We're using the word macro when we have a huge story, like the entire Tanakh is one story. Well, the Tanakh has an overall macro plot. However, because the Tanakh narrative is open-ended, meaning that the story of the history of Israel did not finish, did not conclude at the end of the Tanakh, right? It's going to continue, and even today, it's not over yet, right? It goes all the way to the end of the book of Revelation. So because the Tanakh, the narrative of the Tanakh, is open-ended, we know that the Tanakh plot is not complete, meaning we're not done with the story yet, guys, right? So the Tanakh is not the end of it. So the plot of the Tanakh is not complete. On the contrary, because we believe that the New Testament is the rest of the inspired history of Israel, the complete plot is found when we put both sections together, the Tanakh and the New Testament. That's how we have a full plot. Now, here's what's amazing. We've done that here. Here's the plot structure of the whole Bible. You ever heard that before? The plot structure of the whole Bible. Look at this. The context is Genesis 1 and 2. But guess what? The conclusion is Revelation 21 and 22. You already knew that. You already know that Revelation 21 and 22 reads just like the Garden of Eden in Genesis 1 and 2. So guess what? We already have right there, we have our context, meaning the setting, and the conclusion of the story. Great. Now we need all the other 3. Okay. The conflict, of course, begins in Genesis 3, right? When Adam and Eve decide, yeah, we're going to give that a test. We're going to take a bite of that fruit. That's where the conflict began. And the conflict, it says in chapter 3, it will be between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. And this conflict is going to go all the way to chapter 18 of Revelation. Imagine that. It covers almost the entire Bible. That's the conflict. We finally get to the climax. There are many climaxes along the way. The cross is one of these climaxes along the way, but it's not the final one. The final one is the final confrontation between the seed of the woman, Yeshua, and the seed of the serpent, the Antichrist, the anti-Messiah. That's the final climax. That is in Revelation 19 when Yeshua comes in a white horse and he kills all his enemies. And then we have the consequence. The consequence says, guys, this is what the story is all about. This is the moral of the story. This is what I've been trying to communicate to you, what I've been trying to do. Guess what? Revelation 20. What is there? The millennium. Because the millennium finally fulfills what God wanted to do right here in Genesis 1 and 2. If the world would have been perfect the way God wanted it, we would have gone from Genesis 1 and 2 to Revelation 20. Nobody sins. Everybody's blessed. Everybody lives forever. There's no death. Of course, there will be death still in Revelation 20 in the millennium because people are still in bodies that have not been resurrected. So, but you get the point there, right? This is what where God's going to demonstrate. This is what I wanted for you, all humanity, and for all the earth. This is what I wanted. This is the moral of the entire story. And this is the plot structure of the entire Bible. Pretty amazing. All right. Well, we only have 10 minutes, but we got a lot left here. Not so much in terms of, a lot, but we're going to make some points here. Let's see if we can go maybe 5 minutes over. Is that okay with everybody? I'm not asking your permission. I'm just saying I'm sorry. Let's read quick here. All right. So the Tanakh and the apostolic scriptures. Now we began to see how the whole plot of the Bible. Now let's see the continuity that there is. You can already see the continuity in the plot of the whole Bible, right? Everything is one story. Now there are theological things that we need to work through here. Here's where we're going to do that a little bit. There is structural continuity. There is plot continuity. And finally, there is theological continuity. Here's what we mean. In terms of structure, the Tanakh and the New Covenant, the New Testament, have an organic structural connection. The focus on the prophet like Moses that is to come alluded to in Deuteronomy 34, and the focus on the prophet as Elijah to come, alluded to in Malachi 4, connect with the opening of the Gospels, where John the Baptist is presented as the Elijah to come and who prepares the people for Yeshua, the prophet like Moses, who was to come. The Tanakh and the New Testament are in obvious biblical continuity. The structural connection between the Tanakh and the Gospels and the entire New Testament highlights the fact that the Tanakh and the New Testament have narrative and therefore theological continuity. That narrative continuity is what we see in the plot continuity. Remember, plot is what makes a narrative, what makes a story. So, viewing the New Testament as replacing the Old prevents the reader from seeing the nature of its unity. If you see it as old and new, you don't see continuity. But if you don't look at it that way, then you see the unity and the continuity. The fact that both sections, the old and the new, right, quote unquote, of the writings lack an independent plot structure, the fact that the Tanakh does not finish the plot structure, and the New Testament lacks the beginning of the plot structure, this means that together they are a united narrative story. And one cannot exist without the other. Now, the conflict of this plot begins in the Tanakh and continues in the Gospels. Therefore, without the Torah, the New Testament does not reveal what the conflict is. And without the apostolic scriptures, the conflict of the Tanakh never reaches its climax. The two cannot be separated. At the beginning of the gospel, Israel is in the same situation as it was at the end of the Ketuvim narrative of First and Second Chronicles. That is, restored from the exile. That's what we still have in the Gospels. The reframing of the plot then is, will Israel have faith to remain in the land and not be exiled again? That's the same plot as when they came back from Babylon. That's what we have in the Gospel. But we know the answer to that, right? The answer to that is going to be negative. Israel is going to reject the Messiah and undertake its greatest exile. While the narrative setting of the Gospels and the entire New Testament is rooted in the plot of the Ketuvim, the prophesied future of Israel in the book of Revelation shows that Israel partially is going to be restored from exile, as we see it now, living in the land. Israel will believe in the coming Messiah when he comes and defeats the seed of the serpent, the Antichrist, at the climax of history. Our point here is that there is narrative or plot continuity between the Tanakh and the New Testament. And when I say that Israel will believe in the Messiah when he comes, I mean the nation officially, from the prime minister down to everybody. I don't mean it like right now that we have Messianic believers, that we have Jewish believers. This we're going to have the whole time. But what I mean is when the nation is going to accept Yeshua as the Messiah, the whole nation, all Israel will be saved. That is going to be at his coming. And that's what I'm referring to here. Finally, we have theological continuity. Because plot is the vehicle of theology and narrative. Okay, we haven't said that yet, but here it is. Plot is the vehicle of theology and narrative. In other words, when you have a narrative, when you have a story, the plot of the story is the vehicle of the theology. The story teaches a theology. When you see the story of Abraham, the story of Isaac and Jacob, each of their stories, it has a theological message. That theological message is carried through the plot. So because plot is the vehicle of theology in narrative, then narrative continuity between the Tanakh and the New Testament implies theological continuity. If you have plot continuity, you have theological continuity because the theology of a story is in the plot. So if you have plot unity, you have theological unity. That destroys discontinuity, the way that they saw it in the early fathers saw it, how they call the Old Testament and all of that stuff. It's destroyed by the fact that the Tanakh and the New Testament have plot continuity, which means they have theological continuity. There are two systems of thought in this area. One system sees continuity between the two sections of Scripture. They see a lot of continuity because its proponents see the church assuming the identity of Israel. So you see, there is continuity that is bad because it's replacement theology. That kind of continuity, that's not what we're talking about, right? That's not what we believe. This is extreme continuity. According to this, Israel as a nation no longer has the role it once had as God's people, and it never will again. This, however, denies the narrative or plot continuity between the Tanakh and the New Testament. The Bible is a narrative unit, and as such, its plot is one. drastic changes like replacing the protagonist, right? I'm going to take Israel out and I'm going to put church in, replacing the the protagonist in the middle of the story is very unlikely. It's bad storytelling. And that do not point to a change in the story, but rather to a failure to understand the story. The problem is in the interpreter, not in the scripture. And because plot expresses the theology of a story, failure to understand the plot leads to a flawed theological system, which we call replacement theology or covenant theology. All right, we got to finish. I got 1 minute. The second system is one marked theologically, is one of marked theological discontinuity between the Tanakh and the New Testament, between Israel and the church. Now, the issue of continuity or discontinuity between the Tanakh and the New Testament, or between Israel and the church, is presented as if it were a matter of degree, or like much or little discontinuity, like it's a thing of degree. But the problem is not the degree of discontinuity, but the identity of the parts that are said to be in discontinuity, in continuity or discontinuity. Is who are you saying that is in discontinuity? That's the issue here. So here we present a different way of considering this theological difficulty. Because many conceive of the church as a Gentile or a non-Jewish body, even if they don't say it, that's really what they're thinking. They see a distinction between the church and Israel as absolutely necessary. However, the church, according to Romans 11, is the remnant of Israel, into which Gentile believers have been grafted as joint heirs. Gentile believers do not become Jews, and Jewish believers do not lose their Jewish identity. The consequence of Israel's rejection of Yeshua as Messiah is that God has entrusted the keys of the kingdom to the remnant of the nation. Look at this. I have number 2 there. What that means is I have a verse here for us to read. I don't know if you can see it. Let's see. I think I'm going to need to do something like this so you can see. Okay. Matthew 21:43. It says, "Therefore I say to you, the kingdom of God will be taken from you." Who is the you here? The kingdom of God will be taken from you, Pharisees, from you leaders, the leadership of Israel. It will be taken from you and given to a people who will produce the fruit of it. And so a good replacement theologian will tell you, there you have it. The keys of the kingdom were given to the church. This people in this verse is the church. But guess what? The keys of the kingdom were given to Peter. And Peter used the keys of the kingdom in Acts 2 to open the kingdom to Jews, and then to open the kingdom to Samaritans, and then to open the kingdom to Cornelius, and through him to the Gentiles. The kingdom that was taken from the leaders of Israel was given to the remnant of Israel. This is extremely important. The kingdom was given to the remnant. It was given to the disciples. They were the remnant of Israel. And then later, God added Gentile believers who were grafted into the remnant of Israel. And we call that the church. Not in theological terms today, but in biblical terms. In the New Testament, the ecclesia was the remnant plus Gentiles grafted in. That is the true definition of the church. The church is not a Gentile thing. The church is the remnant of Israel. So, actually, I did have the verse right there in Matthew 16:19. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. That's what Yeshua told Peter right there in Matthew. All right, so we're landing the plane, guys. So the consequence of Israel's rejection of Yeshua as Messiah is that God has entrusted the keys of the kingdom to the remnant of the nation led by the apostles. But the day will come when the keys will be returned to the leaders of the nation again. The benefits instituted with the coming death and resurrection of Yeshua were not instituted with a body foreign to Israel. On the contrary, the foretaste of the new covenant given to the church, to the ecclesia, to the body, is given to Israel because the church is the remnant of Israel. In this sense, there is a discontinuity or distinction between Israel as a nation and the remnant of Israel, that is the church. So there is discontinuity. There is a distinction between Israel and the church, but understand that the church is defined as the remnant of Israel. God is making a distinction between the nation, the leadership of the nation, and the remnant of the nation. He certainly is making that distinction. But this is not a Gentile body. They're both Jews, except that the remnant has Gentiles crafted in. Now, on the other hand, there is continuity between the Tanakh and the New Testament because they are both about Israel. That's why you have continuity between the Tanakh and the New Covenant. Because the New Testament is about the church, if you define the church as the remnant plus Gentiles, the body of Messiah. I know you may have a ton of questions about this. Because of time, I am going to forego the questions. We can stay later and talk a little bit maybe, but I want to finish and give people the opportunity to leave if they need to. All right, couple more paragraphs. The perceived theological discontinuity in the New Testament is due in large part to a perceived discontinuity between the law and grace. But in reality, what the New Testament teaches is a contrast between the Pharisaic understanding of law and grace. That's extremely important. People confuse the way the Pharisees generally practice the law with the original intent of the law. But this is a mistake. Being under the law means being under the Pharisaical interpretation of the law and does not refer to the law itself. Similarly, the phrase the works of the law means the official Pharisaic interpretations of the law, not the law itself. And each group had its own interpretation, like the Essenes of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Pharisees, etc. The Pharisees who attempted to mix faith in Yeshua with Pharisaic observance of the law, like what we see in Acts 15 or Galatians 2, they were rejected by the apostles because the apostles themselves were not under the authority of Pharisaic interpretation and practice, but not because they saw a great discontinuity between the Tanakh and the New Testament. They saw continuity, but they saw the Pharisaic interpretation for what it was. Now, to say it differently, the theological continuity between the Tanakh and the New Testament centers on Israel. At the beginning of the New Testament, Israel was in the land, but the Messiah appeared and the leaders rejected him. He, in turn, focused on the remnant of Israel, although he died for the entire nation and the entire world. Due to this rejection, the nation was judged, resulting in the destruction of the temple and their exile. But the nation will be restored in the future to the land and to the covenant favor. But until then, God is working through the remnant of Israel into which the Gentile believers have been grafted.